So, for section 3, we are going to be talking about the cultural changes that happen across Europe during this time period. If you remember previously, we mentioned how this time period was kind of fell right at the tail end of the Renaissance and would extend for a couple hundred years after that. So, following the Renaissance, we are going to see still a strong appreciation and attitude for art, music, culture, all of those types of things. And we're going to see that the techniques of the Renaissance are going to extend in some kind of new artistic and cultural trends in that time. So, we're going to start by talking about the art movements that occurred in this time period. The first one is a new style that's going to develop that's called Baroque art. Baroque art. So in your notes, you will see there's a little chart there with the term Baroque. And so we're going to describe that art so we kind of understand what it encompassed. So the first thing that we want to note is kind of when this all came about. So we want to say that this was an art movement of the later 16th and 17th centuries of the later 16th and 17th centuries in which the art was used to appeal to the emotions and senses. And that's really kind of the key to this particular style of art. If you remember with the Renaissance art, we talked about how we started to see the art kind of depict emotion and show emotion in those pieces. Now, with Baroque art, we see it kind of take it to the next level where the art wants to not only convey emotion and show emotion, but also have the audience have a reaction to it, that the audience is, um, you know, enthralled by it or disgusted by it or whatever it might be. And so that is where we start to see this kind of particular movement transition and kind of extend into this new style. So let's talk about kind of the elements of this style of art. So in the second box, we want to say this style has elements. This style has elements of grandeur. Grandeur is Grandeur, comma, richness, comma, drama, comma, movement, comma, realism, comma, naturalism, comma, and often blends many styles. So we see that this particular type of art has many, many descriptors to help us kind of understand what those pieces looked like. It took a lot of kind of the artistical styles of the Renaissance, like, more realistic paintings and pieces that conveyed emotion, um, paying attention to the use of light and things like that. And it's going to take those and kind of expand on them and push them further. So this particular movement is very much a kind of extension of a lot of the art that was happening previously in the Renaissance. So in the third box, let's write that. We want to say this art took many Renaissance styles. This art took many Renaissance styles and made them better and then put a semicolon, and we want to say this style is very broad. This style is very broad in its description. Very broad in its description. So we have, this particular style of art kind of being a little bit taking that art that we previously saw and pushing it to the next level. So the last thing we want to note is kind of something that continues with that idea, which is the subject matter that we are looking at in this art. So for the fourth box, we want to say this style of art came about due to shifting social hierarchies, and allowed for a growing middle class. To become more involved in art patronage. PATRONAGE. Put a semicolon. And then we want to say the subject matter included many Renaissance themes, like Greek/Roman mythology, and Bible stories, comma, but also more realistic, everyday themes. So we start to see that the Baroque art, one of the reasons the subject matter transitions is because more and more people of the middle class are going to start to invest in art. And so that means that they want to see, kind of a broader spectrum than just necessarily the same themes in the Renaissance. And they want art that appeals to kind of everyday life. And so because of that, we're going to see the subject matter include not just kind of those themes of Greek and Roman mythology and Bible stories, but also we're going to see the art include kind of some everyday type experiences that are going to be encompassed in that. So now let's look more at some of the Renaissance art of this time. I've selected three Renaissance artists, and we're going to kind of look at them, a little bit about their background, and then identify some pieces. And for this, we're just going to do a real kind of general overview. So we're going to start by talking about Gian Lorenzo Bernini. And we want to say, first thing about his background information is that Bernini was a very popular Italian artist of this style. Very popular Italian artist of this style. And the second thing that we want to say about him is that he was a sculptor, SCULPTOR, and architect, ARCHITECT, sculptor and architect. So he did pretty much solely sculptures, as well as focusing on kind of the designs, especially of kind of the buildings that those pieces were displayed in, or kind of the areas that they were set up in. So let's talk about kind of four of his pieces that you can see if you are traveling around Italy today. The first one is the Triton Fountain, which is located in Rome. So we want to put Triton Fountain under pieces for the first bullet. And this is based off of a story from mythology, showing kind of the stories of Neptune and the Tritons. And some of you might be familiar with the term Triton if you've ever seen the film The Little Mermaid. That kind of idea is built in there. And so this sculpture is kind of showing a figure of almost kind of like a merman that is posed on these seashells and emerging. So it's a very unique sculpture right in downtown Rome. The second is a sculpture that's called the Ecstasy of Saint Teresa. The Ecstasy of Saint Teresa. And this particular piece, as you can see, very detailed. We can see the advancement in the sculptures of this time, how so realistic, as well as this massive attention to detail. If you're looking at the piece on the left, you can see it kind of in full, and how much work Bernini did kind of creating that, as well as creating kind of the surrounding space that it is enclosed in. He did both the sculpture and kind of the architecture of that little enclave that it's displayed in. So a very profound kind of artist. And then two other pieces that we want to mention that are his is Apollo and Daphne. And The Rape of Proserpina. And both of these pieces, again, based off of Roman mythology. The previous one, The Ecstasy of Saint Teresa, is based off of a biblical story. But you can see just incredible attention to detail and work, and realistic sculptures that he was creating. So an incredible master of that technique in the Baroque style. So now let's look at our second artist of this style, which is Rembrandt van Rijn. Many of you have maybe heard of him before. He just goes by Rembrandt most often. But Rembrandt, for our first background information fact, we want to say was a Dutch painter in this style. Dutch painter in this style. And then for the second fact, we want to say considered one of the greatest, considered one of the greatest storytellers in art, greatest storytellers in art, who was able who was able to render means R-E-N, or is spelled R-E-N-D-E-R, means like to depict or create. Was able to render people in various moods using a highly realistic technique. Using a highly realistic technique. So Rembrandt is going to be one of those painters that is going to definitely kind of push this style into kind of a new time period, and definitely make it so that the realistic nature of his pieces are strongly highlighted. So let's talk about a few of his pieces. The first one is pictured there beside him, which is called The Anatomy Lesson of Dr. Nicholas Tulp. So go ahead and write that down. And then if you're looking at this particular piece, you can see that this is showing some, doctors of that time period examining a cadaver or a dead body. And they are trying to basically learn about the probably muscles, ligaments, and study this person's arm for better understanding. And if you're looking, you can see how detailed and accurate that this piece is showing kind of the individuals of this time period. This painting almost looks to the quality of like a photograph would. It's that detailed. And that's kind of the mastery of Rembrandt in how he tried to picture people in these spaces. So a lot of detail to kind of their faces and what's happening in the piece. So that's our first one. Our second one is called The Night Watch. And this particular piece is displaying men of this time period going out on patrol. The night watch was a term that applied to kind of what we would consider early police patrolling, because the concept of having police didn't exist until really probably like the 18th, 19th century, that people started to kind of form and create actual police units. And so prior to that had been kind of the concept of night watch, where almost kind of like a neighborhood watch, where people would go out and walk around and be vigilant to protect others from any harm. So this is showing kind of the men gathering for this event. And then the last piece is The Storm on the Sea of Galilee. And this piece is depicting a shipwreck that would subsequently happen, that was showing a very terrible storm on the Sea of Galilee. And the ship that was trying to kind of make it back to shore, and highlighting that particular story, which would have been kind of almost like a news story of that time period. So as you can see, all of these pieces incredibly detailed and highlighting kind of events of everyday life, which is what Rembrandt was very famous for. Our third artist that we're going to talk about is Johannes Vermeer. So, for his first background fact, we want to say that he is a Dutch painter of this style. So, much like Rembrandt, also a Dutch painter. Second thing that we want to note is that he was known for doing many scenes showcasing daily life. Many scenes showcasing daily life. And the third thing is that we want to say used light and form. Used light and form for scenes that were timeless and tranquil. For scenes that were timeless and tranquil. Tranquil is Tranquil. So many of his pieces pay attention to kind of like the use of light and shadow. He did a lot of studio work where he would set up individuals kind of posing for him for extended periods of time and then paint them. And he was very specific about like the time period that he would be painting them, so that way he was getting the light just right and conveying those kind of emotions using that those techniques. So we're going to talk about three of his famous pieces. So the first one is called The Girl with the Pearl Earring. Girl with a Pearl Earring. This is probably one of his most famous pieces that he has created. A very kind of unique portrait of this young girl wearing a pearl earring and pretty much otherwise cloaked. But as you can see, a piece that is just timeless. The second piece is called The Astronomer. Astronomer, and kind of an interesting fact, this was a piece that was something that Adolf Hitler was absolutely obsessed with. He loved this piece of art and actually wanted this piece of art in his possession and was trying to track it down during World War II as he kind of went around and raided a lot of art museums in this time period. But he loved this particular piece of art. If you think about the subject matter of this time period, we talked about the scientific revolution. So obviously a career as an astronomer would have been a popular field in that time. And then the third piece is called The Milkmaid, showcasing kind of the everyday life of someone kind of just working for a home, fetching milk and bringing it back to the house. Now, as you can see, if you look carefully at these two pieces, you can see that they both were created within the same studio, but just kind of the background of the studio was set up differently. You can tell that by the window that is used in both of these pieces that looks almost identical. So we can tell that Vermeer created both of these within his studio. All right, so that is some examples of Baroque art. Now we're going to talk about the style that follows right after Baroque art, which is what we call Rococo art. So we'll just briefly talk about this. So in your box underneath Rococo, the first one, we want to say that this is an art movement of the 18th century. Art movement of the 18th century, often called the late Baroque style. Often called the late Baroque style. So this is kind of an extension of that art, but a little bit different. So for our second box, we want to say this style, this style featured whimsical. Whimsical is Whimsical, whimsical, comma, light themes, whimsical, light themes, which were often, which were often outdoor scenes, which were often outdoor scenes, and evoked, evoked is EVOKED, feelings of happiness and love. Evoked feelings of happiness and love. So this particular style kind of took a lot of those Baroque themes, but just kind of extended them, made them a lot more lighter, playful, fun, happy, joyous. So kind of a little bit more of a lighter style where Baroque was a little bit more dramatic, heavier, things like that. And one of the ways that they did this and making it kind of a lighter style was by using the color palette that was a little bit more playful and fun. So for the third box, we want to say was an elegant style of art, was an elegant style of art that used colors, like ivory, like ivory, comma, gold, comma, or pastels, or pastels. So a great example of that is if you're looking at the piece in the upper left, kind of showing all of those different kind of colors, much lighter colors, a lot of pastel colors. Pastels are kind of like the Easter egg colors. So a very kind of light style of art. And then the last thing that we want to say is that an example of this particular style of art, so we want to say the best example of this style, is France's Palace at Versailles. And Palace at Versailles is there on the screen for you. France's Palace at Versailles. And this particular structure was the home of the King and Queen of France that was built by King Louis XIV during this time period. And this particular piece of architecture is very encompassing of this style. Tons of use of those different colors, lots of gold fixtures, crystals, use of kind of like black and white and fun patterns like the piece there in the left showing kind of the central courtyard. Now this structure is still around today, one of the top visited places in France. And it just kind of showcases this entire style. We will see this structure more so in our next unit when we talk about the French Revolution. So we'll come back to that at a later time. All right, the last thing we're going to talk about is the music of this time period. So we're going to start by talking about the new musical style, which was the style of Baroque music. So in the top box, there's a couple things that we want to say. First is that this was a music movement between 1600 and 1760, 1600 and 1760, that mirrored the art movement, that mirrored the art movement. So many of the same kind of styles and attitudes of the art movement were carried over into the musical movement as well, like drama and richness and all of those types of things. The second thing that we want to say is that this conveyed many of the same elements, conveyed many of the same elements using musical elements, like tone, and complexity of musical compositions. Tone and complexity of musical compositions. So doing the same types of things, just using musical techniques to do them instead of artistic techniques. And then the last thing is we want to note some of the new genres that come about during this time period. So we want to say established the opera. Opera is OPERA, which many of you have probably heard of before, opera, comma, concerto. Concerto is CONCERTO, comma, and sonata. Sonata is SONATA, and then we want to say musical genres. And genres is GENRES. So many of the major styles of music in this time and kind of the different sizes of musical pieces that exist came about during this time period. All right, so that leads us to talking about some of these musicians and composers of this time period. So the first one we're going to talk about is Johann Sebastian Bach. So we want to say for him, for our first kind of bullet and fact, is that he was a German composer and musician. German composer and musician. And then for the second bullet where it says famous pieces include, we want to note the famous pieces that are on the screen and put commas between them. Now, I'm not going to pause for long, so you can pause this and get those copied down, and then we'll move on to the next one. So the three pieces are the Brandenburg Concertos, the Cantata number 21, and Organ Fantasia and Fugue in G minor. Our second artist is George Frederick Handel. And for Handel, first thing we want to note is that he was a German composer. And his famous pieces that we want to note include Water Music and Messiah. Water Music and Messiah. Our third of this style is Antonio Vivaldi. And Vivaldi is an Italian composer and violinist. Italian composer and violinist, which is violin with IST at the end of it. And the two pieces we want to note by him that are famous are The Four Seasons and Gloria. Now, the second musical style that comes about a little bit later in this time period is what we call classical music. Now, classical music is usually the term that's used to encompass all of this type of music, but it was a very specific movement within this time period. So, the first fact we want to say about classical music is that it was a music movement between 1760, music movement between 1760 and 1820, which was a lighter style of music, which was a lighter style of music. So kind of similar to Rococo art, to Baroque art. The Rococo was much lighter in style, same with kind of classical to Baroque music. The second bullet we want to say is that it used larger orchestras. Orchestras is Orchestras, larger orchestras, and new instruments. Like the harpsichord. Harpsichord is Harpsichord. Harpsichord. So a harpsichord is actually almost kind of like a smaller piano, and it has a higher pitch and tone to it. So it gives the music a lot of a lighter feel than a traditional piano, which is a little bit heavier and deeper in sound. So let's talk about three artists of this time that are musicians, I should say. The first one is probably a name you've heard before, Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart. And the first thing we want to say about Mozart is that he was an Austrian, Austrian, not to be confused with Australian, that's a totally different place, but Austrian composer and musician. And something that's very interesting about him is he is what's called, this you can put for your second bullet, a musical prodigy. Musical prodigy, Prodigy, who played the violin and piano, for royalty at age 5. And now I know what you're thinking. Oh, little kids playing music. No, this was like he was playing to the level of people that were in their 20s and 30s at the age of 5, that he was that talented and also composing some pieces at that time. So an incredible advanced individual. So that's where we call a musical prodigy, someone that's advanced well beyond their years at something. And two of the famous pieces that we're going to note by him are the operas Don Giovanni, which is even today considered one of the most famous operas in the entire world, and The Marriage of Figaro. So go ahead and record those. Pause if you need to before going on to the next. So then our second artist of this is Ludwig van Beethoven. And the first thing that we want to say about Beethoven is that he is a German composer and pianist, meaning playing the piano, which is Pianist. And a very interesting fact about him is that he composed most of his famous pieces while being completely deaf. So Beethoven, as he got older, started to lose his hearing until when he was about 25, 30, it was completely gone. And so he actually did most of his famous work after that being completely deaf. So, how he actually did this is he took his piano and he sawed the legs off of the piano and laid it on the floor in his workspace, and then would lay beside it and put his ear against the floor so that he was actually, as he was hitting keys, he was listening to kind of the vibration and the tone of the vibration to help kind of put together the notes, which is just when you listen to his pieces, makes it, you appreciate it even more that someone was doing all of this and couldn't hear a single note of the music that was actually being played and what it sounded like altogether. So that definitely speaks to this accomplishment. And so two of Beethoven's most famous pieces include Symphony Number 9 and Für Elise. And then our last individual of this style is Franz Schubert. And Schubert is an Austrian composer. Austrian composer. And his famous pieces include Ave Maria, Winterice, and Sonata in A minor. So now that leads us to the activity that you're going to be completing for this section. So first thing is you'll take your notes with your checklist and bring them up and show them to me. I'll check those off, and then I'm going to give to you the green paper that you completed on the one side for section 2 when you were doing the Enlightenment Finger Quotes activity. You'll take that paper back, and what you're going to do is open up YouTube, and we are going to do what we call a music reflection journal. So you are going to open YouTube and select one piece by each of the musicians that we discussed. So you'll see on the paper, the chart has each of the artist's name, and then it says piece, and then it says reflection. So you're going to pick one of those pieces. I would pick one that we already mentioned that was in our notes. So just look back over the notes and find that piece and select one of them. When you search in YouTube, you want to search starting with the musician's last name and then what the name of the piece is. So for example, if I was looking for Beethoven's Ninth Symphony, I would say Beethoven's Symphony Number 9 and search that in YouTube. And then a variety of choices will come up. Select one that looks like it has good reviews. So you'll click on that, and then what you're going to do is listen to the piece. Now, when I say listen to the piece, I don't mean the entire piece, because some of these pieces can be anywhere from 20 minutes to sometimes an hour or 2 hours in length, because they're almost like full operas or like a musical type style to tell a story. So I want you to listen to generally between 3 to maybe 5 minutes total. And I would suggest jumping around, maybe listening to a minute or 45 seconds of the beginning, jumping to a little bit more of a middle section, maybe 20 or so, 10 minutes later, and then so on and so forth. So you're hearing a couple different sections because the tone and the style and the instruments and things might change as you kind of move through the piece. Then what you're going to do, or you can do this while you're listening, is in that space where it says reflection, you're going to write at least 3 sentences of your reaction to this particular piece of music. In your reaction or your reflection, you can include a variety of different types of things. You can talk about identifying the different instruments that you're hearing in this piece. You can talk about how the music conveys emotions or often makes you think of certain things. You can tell me about the musical style or techniques that are used. You guys who are in band or chorus might be really good at this, so you can use some of that vocabulary you know to explain that. The biggest thing is when you're listening to the piece, try and reflect on how does this piece make you feel? Or if you were trying to describe it to someone else, what kind of descriptors would you use? And that's the type of thing that I'm looking for in your writing. So remember, 3 sentences, at least 3 sentences of reflection for each piece. And then when you're done, you'll go on and do the next piece. So you should have 6 small reflections written And then when you're done, bring the paper back up to me and we'll check you off and you'll do your section 3 quiz.